Hi, my name is Andrej and you're watching the Serbian History Games channel. This is a presentation of my game in development, Serbs Stand Alone, a game of untold World War II in Yugoslavia. Now, a few words on the game theme. I guess if you're at all familiar with what happened in World War II in Yugoslavia, you will be knowing something about that the Yugoslavia was occupied by the Germans and there was a resistance there. It was organized by a person called Tito, which was a communist, but a good communist. And that ultimately he united the Yugoslavs under his banner and he managed to kick out the Germans. And that he was a war hero and a great guy. This is all, of course, very much supported by the post-World War II Yugoslav communist movies, war movies such as Battle of Neretva or movies like that, which, well, as you can imagine, do represent Yugoslav communist propaganda. So, I mean, they are great movies, they're very well done, but they have more in common with The Lord of the Rings rather than with The Longest Day. In order to give an introduction to what actually happened in Yugoslavia, I decided on this front page and on some quotes on the back side of the game. So this front page represents not Yugoslav partisans, but the other resistance movement called Chetniks. Now, people that have more information on the war in Yugoslavia know that the Chetniks collaborated with the Germans and that they were evil guys. However, this front page is made based on a photograph from the fall of 1943, the time when the Chetniks were allegedly collaborating with the Germans. But as you can imagine, Chetniks stomping on a German flag goes a little bit against the narrative. The other thing is that the two quotes that I'm using on the back page of the game. One is a quote about Tito, coming from the Germans, and it would sound familiar, saying that the main enemy is Tito. This goes very well along with the communist movies and propaganda. It's just that this quote is from the late fall of 1943. There is another quote, and this quote is on General Mihailovich, the leader of said Chetniks. And it's from a person that you might recognize relatively high up the German hierarchy, a man called Himmler, who's saying in the middle of 1942 that the main enemy is Mihailovich, not Tito, but Mihailovich and his Chetniks. So this is the part that is not very familiar to, well, persons abroad and even persons here in ex-Yugoslavia. This was kept under wraps, because obviously this goes against the propaganda of the communist regime. So, as opposed to having a game where some Germans chase some partisans, which is, I mean, it's obviously interesting and exciting by itself, here we have a game where there are many sides, where there is combat but also diplomacy, and where things get very, very complicated, but also very interesting for the game player. The game is made for two players. One player leads the so-called Chetniks, which is actually a semi-inaccurate name for the Yugoslav army, because the Chetniks were simply a popular name or a popular slur, which was given to the forces of the Yugoslav army that remained but were not captured by the Germans when they invaded the country, and which continued their resistance from day one. The other playable side is the communist partisans led by Tito. They actually engaged in the fight against the Germans and the occupiers from the summer of 1941, not from the moment when Yugoslavia was occupied, but from the moment when the Soviet Union was invaded. Why aren't the Germans a playable side? Or the Axis in general, why aren't they the playable side? Well, because, and I'm going to quote Marshal Tito here, or paraphrase him, saying to his subordinate commander, you shouldn't really have meddled with the Germans and their auxiliaries, because at this point the main enemy is Mihailovich. The Germans will leave, but Mihailovich will stay. Having this in mind, the two playable parties are the ones that intend to control Yugoslavia after the war. The Chetniks representing the old Yugoslav government, the Royal Yugoslav government and the Royal Yugoslav army, and the communist partisans, obviously representing the communist side, led by Tito, who will want to take over Yugoslavia after the war. So we have a very, very complex situation here. I've tried really, really hard to make the game as simple as possible in terms of its mechanics, in order to be able to convey the various strategic dilemmas that both Mihailovich and Tito had during the war. Simply due to these dilemmas and due to these various objectives of both sides, I was able to make Mihailovich playable in a solo game, while Tito is not. So you can decide either to play a two-player game with both the Chetniks and the partisans are playable parties, or just played a solo game where Mihailovich and his Chetniks are playable and you are in their position and you're trying to achieve their various objectives, because they have various different objectives which make their life very difficult. On the other hand, Tito's objective is relatively simple. He wants to take over Yugoslavia, period. If he kills, in the meantime, if he kills Germans, Chetniks, Serbs, Croats, whatever, he'll do it. He just wants to control Yugoslavia after the war. And if possible, he would like to wiggle out of the control of Stalin. In the beginning of the war, he is Stalin's agent. He works for the Comintern. But as the war progresses and he historically managed to make a link with the British, he would be trying to make himself a more and more independent agent. On the other hand, Mihailovich has various different objectives. Not only is he fighting, obviously, the partisans for the control of Yugoslavia, he obviously would need to fight the Germans, as the partisans do, and also he would be needing to fight and to prevent massacres of Serbs, because he is a national leader as opposed to Tito. So he is trying to prevent civilian casualties of his own people, but this will not be easily possible. There are some people that frankly want to kill as many Serbs as possible, and also the Germans are very keen to undertake reprisals on any actions taken against them. And on the other side, Mihailovich has those wonderful allies, the British, which want him to openly attack the Germans, which would in turn lead to Serb casualties and Serb massacres. So he is in a bind. He has a much more complex situation than Tito does, so hence he is playable in a solitaire game. Now let's talk a little bit about the game mechanics and how the game is set up. Okay, I want to use this opportunity to go through the game mechanics, which is set out in the player aid, which sets out both the phases of a turn and the phases of combat. Now, to give you a short breakdown is, first of all, if we're in a spring turn, we will be adding cards to the deck and shuffling those cards. So for each card there is a designation whether this is an initial card or if this card is added into the deck at some given turn. The fact that the card is added in the deck does not really mean that this card is immediately played. It's just in the deck. It may be drawn, for instance, if it's added in the second turn, it may be drawn in the third. Now in each turn, 2 cards are drawn, 2 assets, and 2 troubles. In some turns, some assets and some troubles have a designed effect that a third asset or trouble can be drawn. This is only for some very specific cards. So we look at those cards, we take into account their effects, and we perhaps move in the supports because of that. And afterwards we see if on this turn some kind of event comes into force. After that we go into the reinforcement phase. For reinforcements it's important to consult the support tables and also the command card tables. So, or the command cards themselves. So each support designates how much either the Chetniks or the partisans have support points. So for instance, if the Serb support is at 5th place, Chetniks have 2 and partisans have 1 support. Meaning that Chetniks place 2 reinforcements while partisans place 1. Actually, it's the other way around because partisans move first right until the end of the game. Okay, there are 2 activation rounds if we play a 2-player game. However, if we play a solo player game, the command cards designate how many activation points are given per each activation round. So for instance, since this is the beginning of the game, this is the first turn, the commands are not very sophisticated at this point. The guerrillas are very much disorganized and they only have 2 activation points in the first round and no second round. Now, as in the reinforcements, during the activation rounds, the partisans move and attack first, while the Chetniks move and attack second. It's simply that the partisans at this point are more nimble. They have a lower strength than the Chetniks and a lower number, so this gives them a more efficiency edge over the Chetniks. Later in the game, this might change. The activation points can be used in a solo game for attack or moving, and in a 2-player game they can also be used to place additional reinforcements or to give a small combat bonus. Also, activation points can be used for sabotage. Sabotage is a specific way of attacking the Axis that cannot really destroy their units, but is beneficial to the insurgents because it may lead to those insurgents becoming more elite. For the Chetniks to become veterans and for the partisans to become proletarians. Now, at this early stage, for instance at the beginning of the game, all Chetniks or partisans are basic units. On the other hand, we have the Axis units and we have Serb collaborators, Croat collaborators, Italians, Bulgarians and Germans. Each of these units have specific characteristics, and what is very important for the destruction of these units, there can be effects on the supports. So for instance, for destroying a German, you have very, very beneficial effects both for Serbian and for Allied support, while for destroying Serb collaborators, there's basically no effect. Nobody cares. So on the other hand, there is something that should be taken into account, is that while you can destroy the Germans, you can destroy Italians, you can destroy Bulgarians, there is a downside to it, and it comes from their reprisals against civilians because you destroy their units. And those reprisals can very well basically wipe out any beneficial effect you had for attacking and destroying them. Now, when you go and activate provinces and use your activation points, you can use them for movement, you can use them for attack, either the Axis or your opponents, and you can use them for sabotage. What is important to note that these units, these ordinary units, are immobile. Units have to be elite in order for the insurgent player to be able to move them to any other province. Otherwise they can't move, because these normal units are simply militia and they're tied to their homes. Also, you can attack the Axis in your province and you can attack your opponents in another province, and after you attack them and destroy them, you can go ahead and attack the Axis. So these are the basic effects of how the game is played. What is important is that afterwards, after the activations, after you have gained, your supports for destroying, for instance, the Axis, then comes the effect of Axis offensives and their reinforcements. Basically what happens is, right until the very end of the game, when the Germans start retreating, all of the Axis units you have destroyed come back as reinforcements. So the point of the game is that you're actually a guerrilla formation. You're not in a very good situation, and you can, just forget about liberating the whole of Yugoslavia, because that really doesn't work. The Axis is more numerous, and they can come back and send in reinforcements at any time. This is an annoyance to them, yes, but ultimately all of your efforts are in vain right until the very end of the war. The other thing that happens is, for instance, if you had say, a huge concentration of forces in any one province, the Axis sees this, and they come in, swoop in, and basically destroy all of your supernumerary units in a survival phase. The survival phase includes both the Axis attacks, desertions, diseases, lack of food, whatever. It's simply a lot of insurgents cannot live in any one province. They're simply an easy target, and the Axis can come in and destroy them. So you want to spread out your units as much as possible. On the other hand, if your units are spread out, they're easy targets for the other guy. So there's all kinds of so nice and nifty dilemmas in this game. Also, what the Chetnik player needs to take into account is, if the partisans come in Serbia and they have a critical mass of units there, they start their own revolution and their Red Terror, and the Chetniks start losing points immediately. Thank you for watching this presentation. Please follow the game news on Serbian History Games pages on both Facebook and Instagram, and I will keep you posted.